Living in the United States, it's hard to imagine a metro area of 1.5 million, say, Louisville, Kentucky, building new grade separated rail in its downtown core, or reallocating space on major downtown streets to make them more people-friendly. But that's exactly what's happening in New Zealand's biggest city, and it's just the beginning. City visit Auckland, or maybe Tamaki, Makaurau, I'll explain. Coming up next. If you're new to the channel, a city visit is like an urbanism travelogue / video essay about the things that make a city unique and that we can all learn from or maybe avoid depending on the city. So a little more about what I'm doing on the other side of the globe. Number one, I like cities and I like to visit them. Number two, I need to get away from the US sometimes, maybe now in particular, just to get some perspective. And three, New Zealand and Australia have a lot of interesting cultural and historic commonalities with the US that I think make for interesting comparisons, and yes, Sydney and Melbourne content also imminent. One thing I need to address up front, I heard from a lot of people who wanted me to talk about how sprawling these cities actually are. You can confirm this yourself with publicly available aerial imagery, but I want to be clear about how I approach these city visits. I stay downtown or in a close-in neighborhood, and then I go to places where it's reasonably convenient to walk, bike, or take transit. It's basically the ethos of this channel, and I don't apologize for it. The parts of the metro area that I can't access without a car aren't places I would want to live, and they certainly aren't places I want to spend any time visiting when I travel halfway around the world. Those are places for people who just don't watch this channel in the first place. My focus is the transportation and urban planning aspects of the places I visit. So even though tall, needle-shaped structures with observation decks in the middle of your city are obviously cool, I did not go up this thing and we're not going to talk about it anymore. Another thing I'm not going to spend much time talking about, there's an entire cottage industry researching Auckland's zoning reform, and the 2016 Auckland Unitary Plan did upzone the majority of the city's residential land to allow for a variety of multifamily housing types, and the data do say that upzoning was a success, but permitting has stalled out in the last couple of years, mostly due to macroeconomic factors. To be honest, townhouses and missing middle housing aren't that exciting to film anyway, but I will talk about where the city is adding density in central and transit-supported areas. And some of this is happening in the Wynyard Quarter, a new mixed-use district that's being built on reclaimed industrial land along the waterfront just west of downtown. So back to the naming thing. I'm going to use the name Auckland, number one, to cause less confusion for my majority Western Hemisphere audience. And two, because I have enough trouble pronouncing English words without even attempting Maori. But New Zealand, or Aotearoa, is extremely serious about putting Maori names and words front and center. Like, in the US, we do land acknowledgements before public meetings. Well, New Zealand not only literally changes the names of everything, but they want to tell you to leash your dog in Maori. It's gonna be a theme in this video. So Wynyard Quarter is a good example of the urban design ideas the city is trying to integrate when they do redevelopment and the measures they take to protect walkability. Side question, is there anywhere in the US that has implemented retractable bollards? This stuff seems so obvious when I see it in other countries, yet I can't think of a single good example in the US. Someone enlighten me. Okay, I am going to spend a lot of time talking about transit in this video because Auckland is super interesting on this front. So let's go to the heart of the network. Britomart Station, a former post office building that was repurposed as a train station in 2003 and is now getting a name change, and I'll attempt it, Waitemata. First of all, the entire area around the station has been completely transformed in the last couple years with public plazas and new commercial developments, not just for their own sake, but also related to major changes to the operations and capacity of the station itself, all of which are happening underground. I'm going to be honest, while I was here, I spent more time on buses and ferries than on trains, and I'm going to get to all of that too, but let's descend on down to the platforms and hop one of these bad boys. By the way, the entire transit system in Auckland is run by one agency, Auckland Transport. You tap on and off everywhere on every mode, and you can just use the wallet on your phone. Not every transit agency in the world has figured out this amazing technology yet, so I don't take it for granted. We're going a couple stations out to Newmarket, which gets a lot of train service and you would think is primed for a ton of housing density. And everything Auckland has done to enable missing middle housing is cool and important. But when you go to Newmarket, the density mostly consists of a massive Westfield shopping complex. And look, I'm as big a fan of Jamba Juice and like kiosks that sell phone cases as anyone. All I'm saying is this might not be the highest and best use of prime station area real estate. It's a little baked in at this point, so let's talk about the newest thing happening with Auckland's rail system, which is City Rail Link. We're back on the platform at Waitemata, which has been a terminal station since its inception, and now they've punched a tunnel through to the west under the new plaza, which is going to allow through running that'll improve operations and capacity and expand the network. I'm not going to be able to get away from Maori names because, well, the new Midtown station under construction is Te Wairotui, and I'll get to another new station in a bit. One thing to note about what they're doing with the City Rail Link project, while they're tearing up the streets to make way for new stations, they're upgrading a lot of them, repurposing travel lanes to create new bike facilities, better walking environments, and more urban design features. A lot of times, this kind of thing is very half-hearted when it happens in the US, and my understanding is there were a lot of battles that happened in Auckland to try to get this right, and I think largely they did. So from my perspective, the rail coverage is pretty good for a metro area of 1.5 million, and getting better, but it leaves a lot of important gaps. So let's talk a bit about the bus services. There are a few higher frequency routes with the Link branding, and because of where I was staying, in the Herne Bay neighborhood to the west of the CBD, Outer Link was the route I used most often, and the frequency was fine. I think it's like every 12 minutes most times, so the inner neighborhoods are pretty well connected. The service I really want to highlight though is the Northern Express. There's no rail going to the north side of the harbor, so in 2008, Auckland Transport opened a new bus rapid transit line that runs mostly in a dedicated busway, parallel to the main highway, through the North Shore area. The stations along the busway are really impressive bits of infrastructure. The region clearly made a big investment here, and it seems to be paying off with pretty strong ridership. The stations are literal stations with staffed customer service windows, restrooms, good integration with the connecting bus routes, and lots of bike parking. And these kinds of last mile accommodations are important since the land use around the stations themselves isn't fantastic. Remember, we are right next to a freeway. The buses are really pretty sweet. Double-decker, USB charging ports everywhere, although I'm not sure you're really on the bus long enough to make it worthwhile, which is a virtue. There's nothing quite like being on a bus that zips right by traffic congestion, and it makes it all the sweeter when the bus itself is new and spacious, and has great views out over the harbor. Buses often make you feel like a second-class citizen, and the Northern Express has very much the opposite effect. Let's get back to the core of the transit system. Lots of Auckland's buses converge here on Lower Albert Street, just a block away from Waitemata, and I want to get to the ferry terminal just across Quay Street, which runs along the harbor front. But let's linger here for a second because this is another street that the city recently rebuilt as part of the revitalization around the train station. So you get wider sidewalks, a protected bike lane, and a commerce street right dead center of the place where you've got all the transit options. You can street view a lot of this stuff and see how dramatic some of the changes have been. So let's move to the Ferry building on the harbor side of Quay Street. The building dates from 1912, and if it seems familiar, my intel is that it is modeled after the San Francisco Ferry building. You know, back when the idea of model year transportation infrastructure after US cities didn't actually seem ludicrous. Behind the ferry building, the actual ferry terminals, lots of docks with boats departing for all kinds of destinations around the harbor. These are mostly Auckland Transport Services, so it's the same tap-on, tap-off system. You will see lots of bikes on the ferries, and as we tour the ferry system here, you'll see lots of bike parking around the terminals, and they do take their bike hygiene very seriously. And I am into waterborne public transportation, so I had to do a couple ferry rides. I won't spend too much time on these destinations because they're not all that urban in themselves. For example, this is Devonport on the North Shore, but nowhere near the Northern Express BRT, and not especially accessible by car either. So the ferry is vastly more convenient if you're coming from the Auckland CBD. Devonport is charming. It's perfect for an afternoon getaway. The type of community that has a high concentration of old buildings that aren't what they say they are. Here's what I think is important though. Everybody rides the ferry because it's by far the best travel option. It's economical, it's efficient, it's user-friendly, and even though it may not be what you think of as a core transit service, it's something that helps grow the constituency for supporting public transit more broadly. One other stop on our ferry tour of Auckland Harbor, Karangahape Island, which requires a bit of explanation. First of all, for what's essentially a rural setting, a 45-minute ferry ride from the Auckland Ferry Terminal, it has a pretty fantastic level of transit service just internal to the island itself, again, operated by Auckland Transport. I mean, this is just an incredible amenity, a short ride from the city. Karangahape Island has incredible beaches and it has vineyards all over. The distances are reasonable for biking and lots of people do this. But the different bus routes also connect really well to all the destinations. So what I'm saying is, you can take an entirely car-free day trip that involves quality sunbathing time, and or hanging out with a supersized flight and a charcuterie board and getting mildly inebriated for a few hours. Like, I can go to wine country in, say, Yamhill County outside Portland as a day trip, but to do that, I really need a car and I need to plan on like 90 minutes each way. And who wants to drive when they're planning on drinking excessive quantities of the local beverage? Auckland just has all this figured out. Okay, in a minute, I'm gonna get to the thing that made the biggest impression on me as I traveled around the city, and it's something you just don't see nearly enough in the US. Brief reminder to engage the channel in all the usual ways. My hope with this kind of video is that my core audience back home can learn from the way cities on the other side of the globe deal with a lot of the same kinds of challenges we do, and that my viewers in New Zealand and Australia can be entertained or possibly irritated with a US perspective on their cities, and by my terrible pronunciations. I did get to do an in-person event while I was here, which was a ton of fun, and thanks to the folks at Greater Auckland for putting up with me, and for the sightseeing tips. Always appreciated. So I want to make sure I don't give a too glass half full account of Auckland's transportation system. I sometimes talk about the horrors of downtown freeway interchanges on this channel, and Auckland does have a really exceptional one. This is very much a pasta bowl situation where Highway 1 and Highway 16 come together on the south side of the CBD. So if you're from, say, Dallas, Texas, you might feel right at home here. But I want to focus on the good things Auckland's been doing with street redesigns in the CBD. You will find some pedestrianized and low traffic side streets, and you'll find streets that are being rebuilt with protected bikeways and improved pedestrian realms as part of the City Rail Link project. But let's talk about the main north-south artery in the CBD, Queen Street. Now, Queen Street began to take shape in the 1840s, so well before the advent of the automobile, and it's always been the marquee commercial thoroughfare in the Auckland CBD. The history of the street is really a microcosm of the city's struggles with car-centric design starting near the beginning of the 20th century. It was the first paved street in New Zealand, and through a lot of the mid to late 20th century, people walking were relegated to narrow sidewalks and 6 lanes were given over to vehicle traffic. It's hard to imagine all this looking at it now, but if you squint, you can see vestiges of what the old pedestrian right-of-way was and how space for people traversing the street on foot has been expanded over time. There's lots of transit service, but very little private vehicle traffic on Queen Street anymore, because nothing on the street is really accessible by car. There aren't any driveway cuts to speak of, and the street dead ends into the plaza at Waitemata Station. In the US, a lot of our downtowns could be like this, but we allow a ton of traffic in places where traffic doesn't really have any purpose other than circling around looking for parking. It's just a different way of thinking about the basic purpose of streets. They're there to serve the land uses along them and the people walking in the front door, not people driving around looking for places to store their personal vehicle. Let's go to another street reconfiguration in the southern part of the CBD, Karangahape Road, also with a long history as a high street that was corrupted by auto-centric design ideas in the mid to late 20th century. You don't have to go that far back to find some pretty wretched street views, but the streetscape today continues to evolve, particularly with the new City Rail Link station scheduled for opening in early 2026. This was once, apparently, Auckland's seediest district, but with the recent improvements, it's really sprung back to life. Definitely one of my favorite locations in the city. Good transit service, great bike facilities. You know, just about every city of any size has rainbow crosswalks. On Karangahape Road, they not only made a recent vintage pride flag into a crosswalk, they also decided transit shelters and bike lane pigmentation are fair game too. So as a whole, Karangahape Road, the urban fabric and the businesses along it, and the people who gravitate toward it gave me a bit more of the feeling of the direction the city is moving in and the kinds of strengths they're building on. But let's make one more stop because there's still a lot of work left to do. We're going to Ponsonby Road, close in and a bit southwest of the CBD. I want to talk about the street design here, but first off, I'm going to concede that Ponsonby Road is successful along certain dimensions. I definitely walked up here from Herne Bay to shop and eat. There's pretty good foot traffic. The shops and restaurants mostly seem to be doing reasonably well. If a bustling food hall is an indicator species of a successful commercial district, Ponsonby checks that box. But this is a street that prioritizes the movement and storage of personal vehicles to the detriment of everything else. I'm not even just talking about the street cross section, which doesn't have any bike facilities, even though people definitely bike on it. And it doesn't have street seating, just 4 general purpose lanes, a center turn lane, and as much on-street parking as is physically possible to fit. But what's really galling is the pedestrian crossings, or shocking lack of them. You can go blocks here without seeing a marked crosswalk on Ponsonby. What they have instead are curb ramps and extremely narrow pedestrian refuges in the median with no marked crosswalk at all. And New Zealand driving culture being what it is, you can be waiting for a very long time for anyone to yield so you can cross the street. Like, I'll never understand why you implement a half measure like this. Either commit to making it a pedestrian crossing or just don't. You know, there's this insidious thing you'll sometimes hear from certain traffic engineers where they don't want to put in a marked crossing for fear that it'll give people walking a quote-unquote false sense of security. And that's crazy to me. Like, if that's truly your concern, it's not an indication that you should make access more difficult. It's an indication that you should make the street safer, especially on a street like this. This is a central neighborhood, it's pretty transit accessible, but what the street design communicates to you once you're here is that whatever interesting destinations you see on the other side of the street, you might just have to drive to them because it's not worth risking your life over. Or maybe I'm wrong and Ponsonby Road is functioning exactly as it should, but people probably said that about Queen Street and Karangahape Road at one point, and they were wrong. Anyway, sometimes being contrarian is its own virtue. I mean, I guess you can disagree with that, but you'd be wrong. And I can think of no better proof of this than the new show, Abolish Everything, and I'm gonna highly recommend the latest episode, Agreeing to Disagree. The way Abolish Everything works is that a guest is invited on stage to propose abolition of some objectionable aspect of modern life. For example, dentists or annoying beeping noises. The guest is cross-examined by a panel of extremely funny curmudgeons, the political establishment, to unpack the pros and cons of, say, carbon monoxide alarms or root canals, depending on the thing proposed for abolition. And finally, the winning guest is awarded an inordinately large sack of play money based on audience response according to the highly scientific Tirometer 3000. The talent they've pulled in for these shows is amazing, and I think you're going to enjoy. Abolish Everything is a Nebula original show and exclusive to the platform. Now, the content I recommend when I talk about Nebula is usually urbanism related, and there are lots of great city planning, architecture, and engineering related creators on the platform, but Nebula does so many other things so well, and it's also where you can get the latest episodes of Jetlag's new season, Schengen Showdown, before they show up anywhere else. So Nebula is a place where you can find big, ambitious, highly entertaining projects, and you can find smaller creators that work in niche topic areas you love. There's no doubt Nebula has really helped me grow and connect with new audiences, and when you sign up, it really helps support what I do. And keep in mind, signing up isn't just a great way to invest in our community of creators. It's also an investment in continuing to make the Nebula streaming experience itself better and better. Because yes, Nebula is kind of like Netflix for people who are a little too into trains, but on a deeper level, it's a haven for content that's a little more thoughtful, with a pretty big idea behind all of it, raising the level of the entire platform and growing it into a prestige streaming service. So if you use my custom link down the description or the QR code right here on screen, you're gonna get the best deal. All the Nebula content for 40% off the regular price when you sign up for an annual subscription, so $36 or $3 a month. And keep the lifetime offer in mind, $300 you pay once and you get Nebula for as long as both you and Nebula exist. And Nebula subscribers now get guest passes, one every month or 3 per quarter if you're on annual or lifetime. Once active, guests can binge all the Nebula content they want for a week, and no payment info is required. So tons of ways to share and enjoy Nebula, and no matter which way you go, a Nebula membership is a great way to demonstrate your support for a one-of-a-kind, creator-owned platform, and to fund the continued production of amazing originals. And there's great new stuff hitting the platform all the time. So my recommendation, use my link or the QR code right here to get Nebula for 40% off. That's just $36 a year, $3 a month. It's nebula.tv/CityNerd, and then go watch the latest installment of Abolish Everything now. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks as always to the patrons for your direct support. Probably more important than ever because I'm a little concerned about how sponsors and advertisers are going to respond to the brilliant things the new administration is doing with the US economy. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new installment in 2 weeks. I will try to get back on a weekly schedule. It's just a tough time right now, but I'll see you then.